Hello, this is Group 3 of our Gerontology Final Project presentation. We're eager to discuss the impact that social isolation has on the geriatric population. This, of course, is a profoundly relevant topic and one that perhaps has always been important, but is receiving renewed attention from the scientific community following COVID-19. Social distancing is now a household name. So the hope of our research is to gain a comprehensive picture of social isolation's effects on this population. To do so, we've reviewed the recent literature and compiled relevant findings. We found social isolation to have a number of negative ramifications, pointing to the fact that this topic deserves further attention and remains understudied, despite a growing body of literature. In order to examine the effects of social isolation, we should understand some fundamental concepts. Firstly, human beings have a natural desire and even need for community and social interaction. Human communication and interaction gives us advantages that are useful for survival and success throughout life. Human community has been essential for our species about as far back as we can look, for the advancement of technologies, for protection, for motivation, and for enjoyment. We learn from others and pass it along to generations. We find purpose in contributing to others, and social interaction can boost mood and promote happiness. But as human beings age, they experience social isolation more and more. Around 1/4 of non-institutionalized Americans 65 and older are considered socially isolated. That's a staggering number, and the cause for an increased prevalence of isolation among the elderly population is multifactorial. Other individuals may experience illnesses, loss of friends or family, or functional impairments, like mobility, hearing, or vision impairments that could contribute to this higher likelihood of seclusion. But consider also another phenomena like the recent COVID-19 pandemic, or the societal marginalization of various subpopulations, which we will further discuss. I think it's clear and obvious that social isolation among the older population is worth focusing on.
Let's pause and define the term social isolation. Simply, it is the lack of social contact or support. Or in other terms, it's being apart from other humans or the absence of having a social network. This term shouldn't be confused with loneliness, which is the feeling of being alone or isolated. Often, loneliness is a byproduct of social isolation, as you might expect, but, isolation does not necessarily imply loneliness. The two are connected, but not identical. Indeed, many of the studies we reviewed took great care to control for one or the other due to their tie. So why exactly might older individuals experience isolation from one another? Firstly, to prevent the spread of communicable disease. Because of this population's vulnerability to disease and or the proclivity of certain diseases to spread from one person to another, restrictions may be put in place to protect individuals. A notable example of this, as we've mentioned, has been the recent COVID-19 pandemic. Older adults are still experiencing restrictions as a result of COVID-19, even today. And while such regulations may be advantageous in terms of disease spread, they deprive the elderly of benefits of human togetherness and community. Functional impairments may also contribute to seclusion. Mobility impairment, for example, may prevent individuals from getting out of the house. Hearing impairment may decrease one's desire or ability to verbally communicate. And impaired vision or cognition can play their own roles, and so on. Research shows us that adults who are considered vulnerable members of society may experience isolation. New immigrants, homeless people, indigenous individuals, folks living in poverty. and older adults who are marginalized by society, which could include some of the groups just mentioned, but another example are those who identify as LGBTQ+. These people may also be at risk. In addition, isolation may be experienced among this population as a result of changes in their living conditions, moving from a home to a facility, or even the absence of a formerly present roommate or spouse. And it's vital to realize also that some might be experiencing and do often experience many of the different factors just mentioned, placing them at an even greater risk for social seclusion. So now that we've identified its pervasiveness, what bearing does social isolation have on the geriatric population? Our research points to largely negative effects that fit within the 4 categories. These are concerns relating to mental health, physical health, quality of life, and mortality. We will dive into our findings of each of these categories now.
There is an unmistakable link between social isolation and loneliness. Of course, from a logical standpoint, the quality of being alone or being isolated makes one feel alone or isolated. But as stated earlier, these are separate concepts. For example, it is possible to feel lonely in a room full of people. Nonetheless, once again, social isolation is strongly linked to feelings of loneliness. Social isolation also has been connected to increased anxiety and depression among the elderly. This again could point to a natural human desire for companionship and perhaps be attributed to a lack of many of the benefits social interaction affords. In addition to these, social isolation among the geriatric population is connected with an increased prevalence of suicidal ideation and an increased likelihood of attempted and completed suicide. And those who are socially isolated report decreased happiness. On the other side of the coin, meaningful social interaction contributes to improved mood and a sense of purpose, according to research. Finally, social separation's effect on cognitive function is concerning. Mean cognitive scores plummet following a prolonged period of social isolation, and impaired memory has also been noted as an aftereffect of extended periods of social isolation. Additionally, social isolation among older individuals bears a correlative relationship to the presence of Alzheimer's and the onset of dementia.
Individuals who experience social isolation also have an increased risk of all-cause mortality, according to research. We touched on the fact that suicide risk is also increased among socially isolated older adults, and pandemic-specific isolation seems to be linked to several life-threatening health conditions as well. We have established relationships so far between social isolation and the numerous health problems, and there is a tremendous amount of research, not cited in this presentation, that links many of those conditions to mortality. So the link between isolation and a higher incidence of mortality does not at all seem far-fetched. For example, social isolation is linked to cognitive declines, which have separately been connected to higher mortality. We have chosen to cite some of that research in the lower left side of the slide, but there are numerous other scenarios, heart disease, malnutrition, etc., which might further explain the mechanisms behind this association.
Social isolation is also worrisome when it comes to the physical health of older adults. Friedman and Nicole mention that the connection to considerable physical consequences that social isolation bears is comparable to that of risk factors such as smoking, using alcohol, obesity, and age-related frailty. And with that in mind, social isolation can be viewed as a significant problem. Social health, a phrase which encompasses the degree of social seclusion, presence or lack of a support system, and degree of loneliness, were also studied in relationship to cardiovascular disease by Hu et al. Their findings detailed that though each of the constructs mentioned varied somewhat, social isolation plays a part in decreased cardiovascular health. Being disconnected from others is also linked to higher risk of malnutrition. And Boulas et al. Determined that both social isolation and loneliness were independent risk factors for malnourishment among older people. Eating outlines that obesity, heart disease, high blood pressure, and decreased immune response also bear relationships to social isolation. And research by Pohl et al. Found solitude to be related to, and even a significant predictor for, risk of falling. Finally, social isolation may affect medical compliance or likelihood of seeking medical treatment, which is bad, of course, since we understand that poor adherence likely relates to exacerbation of illness, negative clinical outcomes, higher cost, and death.
We already touched on social isolation ties to loneliness. Socially isolated older adults report feeling lonely across multiple studies. Moisick et al. Surveyed more than 15,000 older adults and found 30% of those reported severe loneliness. Another 30% indicated they felt moderately lonely. So a few things here. First, more than half of that sample were lonely, and then also loneliness among this group was connected with both decreased quality of life and decreased satisfaction with medical services. Berezzi and colleagues found similar results among elderly European individuals. Loneliness and social isolations are associated with a decrease in perceived quality of life. Research also points to the fact that, one, a reduction in perceived quality of life is a finding that is particularly pronounced among older individuals as compared to younger people, and two, that more physically active, healthier older adults experience greater reduction in quality of life with social isolations than their less physically active, less healthy peers, which was actually a finding that surprised those researchers. Moreover, a lower sense of self-worth and sense of purpose appear to be connected with isolation, and you can begin to see how so many of these repercussions are intertwined.
Our research brings us to a few conclusions, but this project also reveals opportunities for further study. It's clear that for various reasons, social isolation is commonly experienced by the geriatric population. Sometimes it's implemented on purpose for some benefit, and sometimes it's an inadvertent byproduct. Regardless, we note that social connection appears tied to some benefits, and social disconnection is linked to and may play a part in an increased risk for a wide variety of physical and mental health problems for elderly individuals. Social isolation also seems tied to risk of dying and poorer quality of life for this population, as we discussed. This has sweeping implications for governmental agencies, for healthcare systems and other organizations when it comes to social distancing's purposeful implementation and how to best care for elderly individuals experiencing any iteration of social disconnection. Both the advantages and the risks of social isolation should be weighed when making decisions that might limit social contact for this population. Unfortunately, deciphering exactly when social isolation is more helpful or harmful remains a challenge. We found that most of the literature to this point has been aimed at identifying negative or positive effects of social isolation. Future research, however, could find ways to compare social isolation's pros and cons. Many of the problems found to be connected to social isolation have been independently studied, but their relationships to one another also warrant future focus. Research points to the fact that social isolation correlates to many of the undesirable conditions we talked about, but causation is less studied. That is to say, not much is understood about the specific underlying mechanisms that cause these negative effects in socially isolated older adults. This is another important area for future research. We thank you for joining us during this talk, and we hope this information is a bridge to better care for the geriatric population.